Hello, my name is NJ Hausler, and this is my presentation titled Lassoing Hegemony: How Apple TV Plus's Ted Lasso Presents Counterexamples to Mainstream Hegemonic Masculinity in Television. Today, I will be sharing the academic resources that inspired much of the research that I did, the historical context of the release of Ted Lasso, the frame of analysis behind the research that I did, the thesis that I formed as a result of that research, and the definitions of key terms, the arguments and evidence that supports those arguments in that thesis, and then finally, I will move to my conclusions. Here are all of the academic resources that I used, as well as a reference second to bottom of the entire series of Ted Lasso, beginning in 2020 and finishing in 2023. The historical context of Ted Lasso is that it is an Apple TV streaming exclusive. So this is a show that is not on cable, and it has been released in the world of streaming and is exclusively found there. Its first episode was released August 14th, 2020, in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and finished just under a year ago on May 31st, 2023, with its season 3 series finale. Apple claims that it was the most streamed original television show of 2023, which is quite impressive considering Apple is one of the least subscribed to mainstream streaming platforms. And the show has also received 61 Emmy nominations, winning 13 of them. It has a worldwide audience, although it does have it does have a very large American audience, in particular with its main character being an American who moved to England. The frame of analysis I took was inspired by a question that I had when I finished the show earlier this year, which was how do the male characters in the show present masculinity? How does masculinity compare to traditional masculinity seen in television? Uh, I excuse me. This frame of analysis covers the entire Ted Lasso series. So instead of focusing on one episode or one series or one season, it covers the entire series, following character arcs more so than smaller examples. The William Brozo, Patricia Walter, and Terry Placker 2002 study and Mike Donaldson 1993 journal article really inspired my learning, as it was my introduction to the term hegemonic masculinity and how it is presented in television typically. And then I concluded that there was a difference between Ted Lasso's presentation of masculinity and hegemonic masculinity. So that left me with the question, does Ted Lasso counter hegemonic masculinity? And if so, how? This resulted in my thesis, which is Ted Lasso's male lead characters set an example of men who exhibit emotional maturity, promoting uplifting traits and positivity in the face of hegemonic masculinity in coaching, friendship, and fatherhood. I believe that Ted Lasso shows counter examples to hegemonic masculinity via Coach Lasso's kind coaching, as I call it, and how he navigates the power dynamics at play there, as well as the male friendships in the show and the vulnerability they display in countering hegemonic masculinity. And then finally, I believe that how fatherhood is presented in Ted's relationship with his son counters hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity was defined by Donaldson in his 1993 article as being about the winning and holding of power and the formation and destruction of social groups in that process. He then continues later in the article to connect that to masculinity and links the two throughout history, and shows the very close ties that masculinity and hegemony has, and he defines that as hegemonic masculinity. Two core traits of that were actually found in a study by Brozo, Walter, and Placker in 2002, which found that college students were identifying key traits in masculine lead characters in the television shows that they were watching. And the two most common were an emotional invulnerability and an obsession with power. And Donaldson linked that with hegemonic masculinity. Mirowski and Ross's 1984 article spoke about the emotionlessness of men across various studies across the United States and across many years. Although theories on why that emotionlessness existed differed, all of these various studies have found a very similar emotionlessness in men compared to women. And then R.W. Connell and James Messersmith's 2005 article related that emotional rigidity to hegemonic masculinity. The first key way that Ted Lasso counters hegemonic masculinity is with the coaching. Coaching involves power dynamics. And when Ted Lasso joined AFC Richmond in the show, he had very many options of how to go about using his newfound power. And he actually was very conservative with it. And when he joins the team, there's a major split in the team following two of the key leaders. One key leader is veteran captain Roy Kent, who is very close to retirement, not nearly as skilled as he used to be, but was once a very, very good player and is also has a lot of respect as a result of his career. Jamie Tart, on the other hand, is a selfish and very dominant athlete who only really thinks about himself at the beginning of the series. These two really clash as a result of their very hegemonic masculine traits. Roy's emotional rigidity, which was associated with hegemonic masculinity, as well as Jamie's need for domination and having power, really clash with one another. And it results in physical altercations as well as a really poor team morale and poor performance on the field. Ted immediately moves in as soon as he recognizes that he immediately starts pulling the strings to get the two to communicate and have a dialogue. He believes that they don't understand one another, and as a result of their communication, they begin to. Jamie Tart is revealed to have an abusive father, and that is his traits that Roy doesn't like are a defense mechanism to that abuse. And Roy himself is very emotionless, which is another hegemonic masculine trait. And he is emotionless on the outside because he's very emotional on the inside. And throughout his career, he had to resort to his anger and his emotionlessness as a survival technique as well. And um, as he really feared retirement. And once Jamie understood that, and then Roy was able to understand Jamie's past, they ended up becoming vulnerable with one another and ended up becoming best friends by the end of the series. And even though they comedically bicker throughout the rest of the series, they don't really ever fight again, and they actually show a deep care for one another. Kreger's 2007 article about coaches actually explains the effect that coaches have. And he says sports have been described as a place in which hegemonic masculinity is reproduced and defined, as an athlete represents the ideal of what it means to be a man. With that being the case, and the effect that coaches have, not just off on the field, but also off the field, Ted Lasso counters hegemonic masculinity. He's promoting emotional vulnerability. And whereas Kreger's article defines, Kreger's article explains that when coaches promote violence on the field and an unhealthy level of competition, it has negative effects off the field. Ted is promoting emotional vulnerability. He is promoting what he actually says in the show as he cares more about what happens off the field than what happens on the field. He's most concerned with developing young men. And as a result, the team forms tighter bonds and they actually have better success than what they were having before when hegemonic masculinity was pretty much running the team. Another way that Ted Lasso counters hegemonic masculinity is in the friendship realm. Roy and Jamie transition from being enemies to best friends, and that's a very big example of that. Mirowski and Ross's 1984 article mentions that the three most common emotions that men don't express are tenderness, affection, and sadness. And Roy and Jamie actually become so close and are able to overcome an original disdain for one another by showing those very three emotions. And whereas Connell and Messersmith relate the lack of those emotions with hegemonic masculinity, The Jamie breaks down scene, as it's called, shows that when those three are displayed, it can be very, very healing for the one that is sad, as well as connecting for the two, helping one another. Jamie's abusive father verbally abuses him, and it ends in a physical altercation in front of the entire team. And this is a moment where the team kind of realizes, as well as Roy is able to realize, why Jamie is at times very selfish. And by this point in the series, Jamie has begun a change and will continue that change for the rest of the series. But that really is facilitated by the friendship. And that friendship was only formed when Roy was able to express tenderness and affection to a very sad Jamie, who was willing to display that emotion with Roy's tenderness and affection. So, a very direct counter to hegemonic masculinity in terms of friendship, showing the positive effects that come from that. Lastly, the series Ted Lasso counters hegemonic masculinity through its discussion of fatherhood. Jamie and his abusive father have a very hegemonic relationship. Jamie's father was not present, and Moreland Richter, their 2004 article talks about the importance of fathers being present and the effect that their presence has on their children. So if they're present with their children in an angry way, it's very likely that that child will have anger management issues when they're older. Um, and in the same vein, how Ted is with his son Henry, he's kind and he is emotionally vulnerable himself, and he teaches his son to have better communication, and he teaches his son to have patience with others. That sort of presence will have very positive effects. Whereas Jamie's father had quite literally told him that he needed to dominate, basically to be loved by his father. Uh, Ted does the exact opposite. He says that it doesn't matter what Henry does, with his life. It doesn't matter where he succeeds, where he fails, so long as he is a good man at heart. It has a much more positive effect on his son. So as a direct counter to the very hegemonic masculine way that Jamie's father raised him, Ted is very tender and loving with his son, and in the episode Signs, it actually results in Henry being able to become a better friend to his friends. When it's revealed that Henry was involved in a bullying incident and he was the bully, he ends up being able to apologize and then rekindle a friendship with the kid that he had bullied, because Ted did not get angry with him like a hegemonic father might. Uh, Instead, he was, while upset, and understandably so, he was upset. He encourages kindness and communication to his son, and it has a very positive effect because of that. So my conclusions are that as a coach, Ted Lasso shows how men in positions of power can properly use that power. And in a direct counter to hegemonic masculinity, men in positions of power are basically shown to, it is shown that they should uh, promote kindness and vulnerability, instead of emotional rigidity, and they should not abuse that power, where hegemonic masculinity would promote emotional rigidity and would promote an abuse of power if it meant you could keep that power. In terms of friendship, Roy and Jamie's friendship arc is, and how emotionally available they are to one another in that one scene, and as well as the rest of the show, is a great example of how being emotional in direct counter and in a direct counter to hegemonic masculinity, it shows the positive effects of that. And in the same vein, Ted Lasso does that in terms of fatherhood as well, comparing Jamie and his father with Ted and his son. So as a result of those three core components, I I assert that Ted Lasso counters hegemonic masculinity with its male characters. Thank you so much for listening.